these very much are the modern myths of the United States. And, Small Town Monsters does an amazing job of capturing those, giving them their own tones, giving them their own, identities, and telling their stories, so that they go on for another generation. And that's very much what happens here with the Bell Witch, 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 the Bell Witch. In the December of 1817, some 200 years ago, the Bell family, along with residents of Adams, Tennessee, became embroiled in one of the strangest and most terrifying visitations of the supernatural on record. Soon after the patriarch of the Bell family, John Bell, opened fire on an unknown creature, unexplained scratches began being heard in and on the walls of the Bell homestead. These scratches would slowly give way to whispers, and then to the fully emboldened voice of the Bell Witch. Though we plan on doing our own look at the odd goings-on in Adams later in 2021, tonight we're turning our attention to the newly released feature film from Seth Breedlove and Small Town Monsters, The Mark of the Bell Witch. The perfect blend of horror movie narrative and deep dive documentary, The Mark of the Bell Witch explores the presence of the witch through various lenses, including the spiritual nature of the phenomena, the folkloric, historic, and mythological aspects of the story as it has been told, and the effects on the town and community of Adams itself. Capturing a moment in the adolescence of America when terror came to Tennessee, the feeling of isolation in the face of supernatural onslaught is made palpable to the viewer. So Nightowls beware. Ethereal black dogs, otherworldly orbs, and disembodied demonic entities lie ahead. But perhaps most dangerously, slight spoilers, as Midnight in Kentucky reviews and discusses Small Town Monsters, The Mark of the Bell Witch. Welcome to Kentucky.
The birthplace of Abraham Lincoln and built on the largest cave system in the known world. The home of Daniel Boone, Hunter S. Thompson, horse racing, and bourbon.
But when the hour grows late, the bluegrass state becomes the breeding ground for realms beyond those familiar to the human race. In the east, ghosts, spirits, and ethereal entities roam the hills and hollers.
In the north, Mothman beats his wings along the banks of the Ohio River.
To the west, small green creatures stalk farmhouses and disappear without a trace when shot.
While in the south, the energy of the Bell Witch is palpable just over the border. Joining with us as we investigate just what goes bump in the bluegrass night.
And ask the question, how many coincidences are too many? There's no need to check the clock.
There's no need to check the clock. Time is an illusion.
Time is an illusion.
And it's midnight.
It's midnight. In Kentucky.
In Kentucky.
In Kentucky. In Kentucky. In Kentucky. In Kentucky. Ladies and gentlemen, and Night Owls worldwide, the full moon has risen once again for Midnight in Kentucky. I'm Ben.
I'm Steven.
Tonight, we are reviewing the new film from Small Town Monsters and Seth Breedlove, The Mark of the Bell Witch. But before we get in that, please, if you are enjoying the shows that we're putting out and the weird stuff that we're talking about with you guys, join us on
Twitter,
Facebook,
midnightkentucky.com.
And, of course, the Ransom Letter Publishing YouTube channel. That's our publishing company's YouTube channel where you can find all kinds of music, Midnight in Kentucky content, and more coming up as the year comes to a close and we start to go into 2021. But like I said, tonight we are discussing The Mark of the Bell Witch, the new film coming out on video on demand and Amazon and all of that stuff on December 15th, I believe. Seth was kind enough to send us a screener to check it out. Should I tell the Seth Breedlove story about how Seth and I first met?
Yeah, that'd be good for our listeners to hear.
It's a pretty great story. I think it was CryptiCon 2017. It would have been right after The Last Jedi come out, so I'm pretty sure that was 2017. And Seth is a very talented filmmaker and shows his subjects a lot of love. So I went over to his booth to ask him. I think they were doing the Bray Road Beast, the showing of that at that CryptiCon. So I went over to the booth, tell him how much I liked it, asked him if they were still doing that. And my wife had on a Last Jedi t-shirt, and he commented on it, and he was like, oh man, good. That was a great movie, huh? Or something along those lines, commented about how good the movie was. And of course, I'm not a huge Last Jedi fan, so I kind of was like, it had its problems. And Seth politely yet firmly asked me to leave his booth.
I love that story. That is a great story. And it's just kind of shows you how dedicated people are to Star Wars.
Absolutely. And I mean, he was of course joking totally. Seth's a great dude. But I've always remembered that story about meeting him. And it's one of my favorite stories about meeting somebody at a convention. And of course, you and I checked out the midnight premiere of Momo the Missouri Monster back in 2019 at CryptiCon. And, going from that movie and going from all of the Small Town Monsters movies and, Invasion on Chestnut Ridge, both Mothman features, Bray Road Beast, and now the Mark of the Bell Witch. It's crazy how diverse all these movies are tonally, and how on point they get that tone, and how that showcases the particular legend or history of these monsters or stories or instances of the paranormal. But let's start there. Let's start with the aesthetics of the movie overall. Just the filmmaking and the quality of the storytelling.
Yeah, I loved it. Also, it was a very good documentary, and described kind of the history of the the area down there in Adams, Tennessee, and kind of all the things that went behind the legend. It seems like they put a lot of work and effort into this, and a lot of research behind it, because there's a lot of things that I think they maybe bring out that a lot of people probably doesn't know, that you don't hear just when you start hearing about the legend. But, they do a good job of, going through the whole legend of the Bell Witch.
Absolutely. There's so much to this case, as there are to all of these, any case once you start digging in, but there's so many different aspects to this case, from the weird animal sightings to the poltergeist-esque things, so much. And they covered all of those very well, and they definitely brought about some new information that I didn't know about the Bell Witch. And the Bell Witch, of course, is one of my favorite cases of this area. We mentioned it in the theme song to the show. Talking about the tone of the film, like back in, I think it was last year when we spoke with him just for a minute. I asked if he had plans to do more narratively based films. And he said they were working on something, and I'm guessing that's what this film turned out to be, The Mark of the Bell Witch, because you could almost remove all the documentary parts, and this movie be like a straight silent horror movie. And those horror movie elements, like the black and white scenes where we get to be with the Bell family, it really reminds me of I can't remember the name of the Twilight Zone episode, but the Twilight Zone episode with the little bitty aliens that the woman hacks to pieces, and it's all totally silent throughout it. And there's so many interesting moments throughout the film, just the narrative horror part of the film. And there's some fucking terrifying moments too. The moment where she just appears in the front of the screen. I've watched the movie 3 times now to get notes, and every single time that moment scares the shit out of me. So the narrative of it, the way that they framed it in in this horror movie landscape is just awesome. And like I was talking about, we go from Momo, which was narrated by a lot, the awesome and famous Lyle Blackburn, one of the most badass cryptozoologists in the world. And, kind of that comical 70s Saturday morning cryptozoologist vibe, which totally worked for Momo and they totally pulled it off. But we go from that to, Mark of the Bell Witch, which is just some brutal storytelling about this family that, is just plagued by all this supernatural shit. And they pulled that off. It's crazy, how they can take all these legends, give them their own individual tones, and still, it comes out as every one of these films have come out as amazing as they are.
Right. And there's, you mentioned the Twilight Zone, and that's kind of what I thought. It definitely has a Twilight Zone vibe to it. And, and you take, as you said, you take the documentary top parts out, the commentation on it, and it's like would be just this Twilight Zone type silent movie. And it definitely resembles that episode of where, the silent episode of Twilight Zone. I forget the name of it, but yeah, it's just kind of terrifying. And that one part you mentioned where she just kind of shows up on the screen. Yes, that's kind of one of those things that sticks with you in these type of shows.
Yeah, for sure. And, they do such a good job of bringing out the terror of this situation on the Bell family and in Adams. Like, that narrative structure of it, it hits hard. Like it does a very good job of hitting all those notes of, I guess, folkloric horror, which, the folklorist that they speak to in this movie points out that there are all these, Brandon Barker is his name. He's a folklorist and a professor, I believe, at a university in Indiana. But, he points out all those folklore elements and all of those moments of those, tropes in the Bell Witch legend, and how much, and that's where horror as a genre comes from is folklore. So, and tropes and being a part of folklore is not a bad thing. That doesn't mean that these events didn't happen. This event in particular, the Bell Witch event, I wonder if it wasn't the inspiration for the episode of the Twilight Zone, and of course for the Blair Witch. I'm sure it was the inspiration for the Blair Witch. It's interesting to see those folkloric tropes and those folkloric things at play, in the early 18th century, and then how the Small Town Monsters crew balances that folklore against, like, the modern horror movie landscape, and how they balance so well together.
Right. They just kind of took all these different aspects of, like, the Twilight Zone and just the folklore, and even aspects from their previous, productions, and kind of put them all together and made this really great documentary, for this, this legend we have right here in our area. I mean, it's not in Kentucky, but it is just, a little bit south of us in Tennessee.
Well, that's actually the perfect transition into getting started talking about the legend itself. Of course, we mentioned it in the theme song, the Bell Witch, just to the east of us. And, it really is just to the east of Kentucky. Adams, Tennessee lies on the Cumberland Basin, which, if I'm not mistaken, is named after the Cumberland River, which was dammed to create Lake Cumberland, which is here in Russell County, where we record, live, and broadcast from, right?
Exactly. Yeah. It's right there in the Cumberland Basin area, and I mean, it is in Tennessee, but I mean, it's in the region, that we reside in.
Absolutely, man. Absolutely. And shit, the Red River, which is the same Red River as the Red River Gorge, which flows through Daniel Boone, if I'm not mistaken. But am I right there? Does the Red River flow through that Daniel Boone National Park?
Yeah. The Red River Gorge is part
of the
forest. Part of the Daniel Boone National Forest.
Right. And as, the historian, Timothy Henson points out in Mark of the Bell Witch, the Red River circles Adams. And man, think about this. How much high strangeness. Hell, me and you have made a whole show out of it. How much high strangeness do we hear about coming from the Daniel Boone National Forest, the Red River Gorge area in particular, and ultimately the Cumberland Basin and the Pennyroyal Plateau? How much high strangeness have you and I heard about coming out of these areas? It's interesting that the Bell Witch occurs on the Cumberland Basin, right? Right with all of these other crazy histories of UFOs, of the Fae, of Sasquatch sightings. Just the litany of things that you and I talk about every show we do.
Right. And the list just goes on and on of this phenomenon that has occurred in this area for as long as, well, as things can be documented. There's even the story about Daniel Boone himself, fighting a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch there in this area. I mean, in this, we got all kinds of other things going on. The Ghost Along the Cumberland, the book by Linwood Montel. And then not to mention all the stuff that Barton Nunley, has discovered and documented in his books around here that's talking to people. And this, this whole region of the North American continent is just kind of full of this type of phenomenon that we really can't explain.
I just realized how much of the show is just me and you being like, it's really fucking weird around here.
Right, exactly.
Right. So, as we can see, the Bell Witch occurrence is far from disconnected from Kentucky. This whole case is very closely related to Kentucky, and in particular, an event that, well, hell, let's just go ahead and get right into it. So the Bell Witch case, as we know it, the main heart of it, which of course, it continues somewhat to occur to this day, from what I understand. But the main bulk of it, the main story that we hear, occurs from 1817 to 1821. And as they mention in Mark of the Bell Witch, this is during the period of the Second Great Awakening. And what other case have you and I talked about on this podcast that occurred during the time of the Second Great Awakening?
Well, that's Pikeville's only Octavia Hatcher.
Yes, absolutely, man. And how closely related are these two cases? I mean, with Octavia Hatcher, we have a spirit, supposedly haunting Pikeville and supposedly looking down from her grave in Pikeville and, supposedly clawing her way out of her grave and all of this stuff to do with the underground. And then in the Bell Witch, we have, the witch, maybe inhabiting the caves of the Bell Witch, or of the area there, the Bell Witch Cave, as they call it now. So both of these things are these spirit entities that occur, around the same area, around the same time, during this time when Tennessee and Kentucky primarily, and the South at large, are going through this spiritual revival where people are being inhabited by spirits and are falling to the ground and, speaking in tongues. It's so interesting that, the Second Great Awakening is occurring and all of these spirits, whether it be the Bell Witch or Octavia Hatcher or, the spirits of heaven, supposedly, or those types of spirits. It just seems like a time when the spirits were just running amok.
Right. And that seems to be the case, across this whole region. And, there were several books about the ghost of Kentucky. And, if you start looking at other states, there's not as many ghost books for these other states than there are for Kentucky. It seems like, there's just tons of these that just kind of has, different stories, and none of them are really duplicated. And it's just volume after volume of these type of things just for Kentucky. And then, some go down into Tennessee. But there's definitely something about Kentucky itself, the land here, in between, the rivers up north and then, everything down south, the rivers down south and the mountain ranges down south. It seems like, even the Native Americans mention, this being the dark and bloody ground, and they only come in here to hunt. Where there was several Native American tribes that did live here, but, they kind of mentioned these type of occurrences also.
Right. Talking about the mountains in Kentucky and in Tennessee, and I would say that Tennessee
And really and I don't want to say that because like you and I have mentioned before, it's almost like you can zoom in on any area and just weirdness abounds if you look hard enough. But you're right, Kentucky and Tennessee and this area in general, the South is one of the most thinnest areas where the veil is thinnest in the world, and that may be our history here. The history that comes up in the Bell Witch, our history of slavery, our history of brutalizing the Native Americans and brutalizing the slaves. That may be why we're so haunted here.
Right. There's just a lot of negative energy from the history of this area. The way, the settlers treated the slaves, the way they treated the Native Americans, just the slaughter of people, the Civil War battlegrounds that kind of is all over the state. And just even the negative energies from those type of ideologies that exist here today, maybe maybe those ideologies are manifesting these type of things to occur, because it seems like that type of thinking exists in this area more than it does anywhere in the United States. And I can, speak that somewhat, from experience, but it seems like that type of negative energy exists here for some reason and doesn't seem to be going away.
Yes. Yeah, you're absolutely correct. It does seem like, the South has a long violent history, as Tyler Childers put it in his latest album. We have a very long violent history, and as I have learned recently, more so, and this sounds like something that seems cliched at this point, but I've saw it personally recently. These things, it goes back to the Nietzsche quote. If you stare into the abyss stares back. These things target people who have been through traumatic experiences and are still going through that trauma, and are still living that trauma. And man, we have hundreds of years of trauma in the South. There, of course, if these entities are attracted to trauma, they're going to be attracted to the South. And that leads us to John Bell, who seems to have had many years of trauma. He seems to have lost quite a few people leading up to the arrival of the Bell Witch. And it seems like the witch causes even more trauma. She forces him to be exiled from the church and all kinds of things. So, the Bells are people who experience trauma before the onset of this thing. And then when this thing come in, it seemed like it just heightened that trauma and forced them to experience even more, which probably, gave the entity more power as we see it evolve.
Yeah, and it seems like these type of entities do attach themselves to people that's going through some type of trauma or heartache in their life or a low point. It seems like it kind of, that's what feeds these things, or maybe causes them to exist or come into view. And maybe that's when, like, maybe that person's personal veil is the thinnest, and that's when these things can come through and enter into reality for them, and this continually cause them problems, just like they was exiled from the church. And and I think looking into that and thinking about that, that's that was probably very taboo for back then, even though it's taboo today. It seems like back then that was probably one of those things where they kind of just wrote him off as being a heretic or crazy even.
Yeah, absolutely. But getting back to the time period of when this major, of when the bulk of the Bell Witch experiences started and continued to happen. Again, as Timothy Henson, the historian in Mark of the Bell Witch, mentions, there were several events, strange events, that led up to the arrival of the witch. And that could be said, these were occurring concurrently with the Second Great Awakening. and would be occurring just briefly before the Octavia Hatcher case. And he mentions these. He says, the Great Comet in 1811, and then there's the earthquakes that eventually forced the Mississippi to run backwards for a amount of time. And then there's the volcanic eruption, and I'm not exactly sure where that volcanic eruption happened at. You may know it, but it blacked out the sky, and it snowed in Tennessee in the summer months. And this is all in the early 1800s, leading up to the arrival of the witch. And I thought that was an interesting history leading up to the witch, because, dude, we think the world's ending now. Imagine what would happen if the sky blackened today and it started snowing in the middle of summer here in Kentucky and in Tennessee. We would be absolutely convinced that the world was ending. And happening alongside of all these events are these spiritual events: the Second Great Awakening, the Octavia Hatcher case, the Bell Witch. So as these great changes and astrological things and geographical things and all of this is happening, there's also this era of spirits, and the spirits are more active, and the veil is thinner. And I just thought that was really interesting, all those events leading up to the beginning of this case.
Yeah, and not to mention, during that time frame, I think it was 1876, we had what's known as the Kentucky meat shower there in Bath County, where it kind of rained those chunks of meat that's still to this day unexplained.
Yeah, absolutely, man. And I mean, the airship wave of the 1800s, where people are seeing these airships that nobody can explain. So much happened during that time period. But so as we go on into the legend of the witch, the legend didn't really get as popular as it is until Martin Van Buren Ingram published his book in 1894. And as they mentioned in the film, he was asked to wait until all the main relatives of John Bell had died, and only to publish it if the public had a misconception of the legend. And it was so cool to see Forrest Burgess from Astonishing Legends deliver that little bit, and he's all throughout the film and talks quite extensively on the Bell Witch, because they did their own episode on it, which is amazing. I think they did a 4-parter on the Bell Witch. But it's so cool to see him. We mentioned Astonishing Legends quite a bit on the show. They're the podfathers of paranormal podcasting. So it was really cool to see him and to hear a little bit about the book that really pushed this case to the public. And I thought it was interesting that Martin Van Buren Ingram was asked to wait until all the relatives had died, or to only publish his book if the public had a misconception of the case.
Right, and I think that was interesting, because maybe the family couldn't dispute anything if they're dead. Dead people don't talk, or at least, not real dead people.
Unless they're the Bell Witch, supposedly, maybe.
Exactly. And, and the whole thing about the public, that kind of makes me wonder, maybe there was more to it back then, but that information was suppressed, kind of the way things are suppressed these days. With similar events, even, with UFOs and things like that from the government. But maybe there was more to this that we'll never know, because that was lost over time and they never put it into the actual book.
Yeah, for sure. And, it does seem like, as is mentioned in the film, Adams, even today, has a love of its history and its folklore, much like Roswell, much like a lot of these little towns, Point Pleasant in West Virginia, a lot of these little towns where weird things like this have happened or continue to happen. It does seem like Adams loves, that history of the paranormal and supernatural that it has. But, I think that's because the bulk of these experiences happen to the Bell family. Yeah. But, it also happened to a lot of different townspeople. Many townspeople were involved in this thing. The William Proctor, I believe, was his name. I may be wrong on that. But he was a bachelor, and supposedly the witch crawled into bed with him one night, and he grabbed the covers and tried to throw it in the fire, and it became a snake. Some of the most interesting accounts come from Aberdeen, who was a slave of the Bell family. He's going to see his wife on a plantation, on a neighboring plantation, and he stopped in the woods by this black dog that won't move and is glaring at him and acting, aggressively. So he kills it. He hits it with an axe and kills the dog. The following evening, he's going back to see his wife, and this dog appears with two heads and is whispering, just all kinds of awful things to him. So it's interesting that these events weren't contained to the Bell family. It happened to everybody in town and to people who were close to the Bells.
Yeah, it seems like the whole town at one time or another had some type of encounter, and you have to think back then, towns were not that big. They were kind of what we would call, like small communities now. But, you're right. Just like, the slave heading back and encountering the black dog, which is another kind of thing that people experience in these type of, I guess experiences. They encounter like these black dogs, which are supposed to be like maybe guardians to Hades and stuff told in the old folklore.
But man, absolutely, you're absolutely correct. Black dogs have a long history, with in Scotland and in Ireland and in America. And that's something I was going to mention before. The Appalachian Mountains, which runs through Kentucky and Tennessee, are one of the oldest mountain ranges in the world. So there's an ancient presence to those mountains. There's talking about this area and talking about the things that are here, these mountains, of course, if anywhere in the world hides secrets, these mountains would hide secrets. These mountains would hide things like that. But talking about those black dogs, of course, there's the links to them mythologically. There's the links to them in folklore and legend. But man, this, to me, the thing that really popped out with those black dogs is, something that you and I have researched deeply, is the dogmen and the canids, and how prevalent those events are around Tennessee and Kentucky, and how much these black dogs sound like a version of the canids, of the dogmen.
Right. And the location of Adams, is in that area that, is not exactly in the Land Between the Lakes area, but it's fairly close. It's a lot closer than we live to it. It's just on the other side of Clarksville from it. And it's, it's not too far from where Fort Campbell is now. So, it's definitely in that region of where many dogmen have been spotted or, canid creatures.
Yeah, for sure. And everywhere you just named, Fort Campbell, of course, was involved with the Mantell incident. The Land Between the Lakes with the dogmen sightings, the Beast of Land Between the Lakes. All those places that you just named have some type of major supernatural significance, paranormal significance. So that's interesting too, But it's not only the black dogs in this case. Leading up to and during the events of the Bell Witch, there were also will-o'-the-wisps or orbs, or, for lack of a better term, UFOs seen all over Adams, in the forests, in the skies. They were sighted by slaves at night from their quarters. So, it's interesting to note that this isn't just a ghost case or a poltergeist case or anything like that. There are cryptids involved. There are UFOs involved. Actually, when the beginning of the Bell family's experiences started in 1817, it started because of John Bell's being out and sighting a creature that he couldn't identify, that he said looked like a dog, a cross between a rabbit and a dog, that he fired at. And it said that the creature took off, and that was the beginning of. It said he's in the film. It mentions that this creature is sitting and staring at him. So he has his gun with him, and he shoots at it, and it runs off. And this is the beginning of the Bell Witch. It's almost like he angered something by firing at this animal. And within days of this, John Bell Jr., I believe, sights a large bird in the area that he believes is a turkey. I'm not positive it was John Bell Jr., one of the Bell sons, but he sees a large bird in the area that he thinks is a turkey. He fires at it, and when it takes off, he realizes that it's an enormous bird that can't be identified. And according to the film, it seems like several people were seeing these large birds and these animals like this. It seems like several people were seeing UFOs and orbs and will-o'-the-wisps and jack-o'-lanterns, whatever you want to call them, in the area. It seems like this black dog is prevalent, which links back to the stories of the black dogs and of canids and of dogs. So it's not just this poltergeist activity, which we're going to talk about in a moment when we get to the entity itself. But it's all of these things. This amalgam of paranormal, a paranormal grab bag, basically. And, that leads you to question, as you and I have questioned many times on this show, if it's not all related, if one of these things doesn't summon another of these things, or, once you get started, if all these things start flooding through, it's just very interesting that with the Bell Witch case, and this is something, absolute honor and respect to the Small Town Monsters team for including all of those things. And that's something they're always good at. They're always good at including the events that occur around the events that they're covering, which I love because those are so important to these cases. But it's just very interesting that there are so many high strangeness experiences and sightings occurring around the witch itself that aren't even the witch. Or aren't the witch proper, I guess.
Yeah, it seems like they are definitely connected. I mean, it seems like they all began at the same time around, with when the witch is kind of showing up. And, that kind of seems like it's the same way with any of these type of events. It's not only just this one thing like the witch. It's these other occurrences, these sightings of these orbs, or these UFOs, or these things in the sky, are these, like booms and stuff that we have around here sometimes. It seems like all these things kind of fire up at one time, and they have to be connected. I mean, I know there's no scientific way of proving they exist or they're even connected, but there's too many people experiencing those things in the same area for it to just be wrote off as nothing, and not it's not coincidental that they're happening all at the same time.
Right. Yeah, it can't be. But you saying that about, not being able to prove it scientifically brings to mind Betsy's writings that, are shown at the end of the film when she says maybe a wiser generation will be able to understand the things that happen to us. And, I don't think that we're that wise generation. I don't think we have any grasp on what this stuff is, but I think we're starting to. You know what I mean? I think researchers are getting more to the point of what these events are and how they're related. I don't know that we'll ever understand them as a species, but it definitely does seem like we're understanding them better as we go along. And it seems like the ideas are getting better. And maybe one day there will be that wiser generation that will understand what exactly happened to the family. But, I don't think that's going to be for several more generations if we are able to keep ourselves from going extinct that long.
Right, exactly. And yeah, it seems like, even back 100 years ago, people were trying to figure out what these things were. And I don't think we're any more further along, maybe just a little bit, than they were, 100, maybe 150 years ago. Right.
Absolutely. And, I think a lot of that has to do with the way that these events and these experiences are treated. It wasn't until really the last 5 or 6 to 10 years that they've started to be treated more seriously, and started to be, and it seems like, of course, now with the disclosure of certain UFO events and stuff, it seems like maybe even government bodies are coming out and saying, look, it's happening. We don't know what it is, but it's happening. And different documents from the CIA talking about, remote viewing and stuff, which I hope to talk about at some point, maybe on a Patreon show. But, it seems like, I feel like a lot of these legends and things were lost because of the way that we've treated these subjects for so long, and the religious, the religiosity behind these subjects, which is an odd duality, because I love the quote that this movie, that the Bell Witch starts with, which is the quote about combating higher forms of spiritual evil. I can't remember the exact quote, but I loved that they started out this movie with that quote. It makes so much sense. But it also mentions in the movie that the churches were split in town about the witch. Some said that it shouldn't be talked to at all. Some said that they went and talked to it themselves. And of course, like we've mentioned very many times, this all occurred during the Second Great Awakening. So there is a vein of religiosity that plays right alongside this.
Right. And you have to wonder during the Second Great Awakening, what exactly was awakened. Maybe there was multiple things that were kind of awakened from wherever maybe it was lying in dormant for a time period. Because it seems like, since then, which that was kind of when the settlers were getting, kind of set up on the land out here and kind of learning things around here. But, I've read a lot of different books and things that talked about the settlers, and they were a very fearful people that was on this new land. They were scared of the woods. They wanted to cut them all down because they was afraid what was in them. Because where they come from, they didn't have like these vast, dense forests like we have over here. And they didn't have all the, the rivers, and it was all kind of new to them and scary, and I think there was a lot of things that, like, such as this Bell Witch and different entities that they experienced over here, that's kind of fed into that fear and kind of grew over time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Who's to say what was in the woods? And who's to say what that fear manifested in the woods? But that's a great jumping off point for the next thing I wanted to talk about, which was the evolution of the entity that was the Bell Witch overall. And it's an interesting thing to look at because, as Brandon, the folklorist featured in Mark of the Bell Witch, points out, it does seem like over time, with the Bells, this entity evolved. It's like it grew up. After John Bell's incident with the animal in the field firing at it, let's talk about that animal just really quick. It's mentioned in the film that it's thought that that animal could have been a hare. And it's said that, hares are not in Tennessee at this time. Nobody know, it's unknown if they were at that time, but they're not native to Tennessee now. But dude, think about the symbolism of a hare, particularly of Alice in Wonderland and the white rabbit. And I'm not saying that this animal was a hare, but if it was, he fires at this thing, and it's almost like it takes him into a completely new dimension of terror and of horror on his family.
Right. It's almost like he angered something. And you have to think prior to, that hare was some type of entity that lived out there for, centuries or decades or however old it could have been. It has never experienced anything like a gun being fired at it because the Native Americans didn't have those type of weapons. And those weapons were relatively, new to mankind, anyways. So that was kind of like some type of maybe Mother Nature spirit getting angered at this new type of weapon that was introduced by the humans.
Yeah, no, yeah, I could definitely see that, like an elemental almost.
Yeah.
And it is interesting, because of course a firearm is a form of technology. And as you and I have seen, the supernatural, paranormal, all of these types of entities, these things that come from the otherworldly, it doesn't seem to like our technology. UFOs shut cars down. Your Octavia Hatcher picture that come back totally static. Um, you know, it seems like encountering forms of technology that are, for lack of a better word, against nature. And I love guns. I'm not saying that guns are against nature, but it is a different type of weapon than a bow and arrow made from the land. So it is interesting. You've got an interesting point there about the gun being fired at it and it being angered. It's almost like the white man comes in here with his technology and tries to tame whatever I am, but that ain't gonna happen. And now you've pissed me off, so it's gonna get bad. And bad it got. Almost immediately after John Bell fires at this animal, the scratching starts on the walls, and they describe it as scratching on glass and in the wall. And again, as Brandon points out in Mark of the Bell Witch, that was a common thing at the time because houses weren't as well sealed, but it wasn't common not to be able to stop the scratching. And the scratching didn't stop. It got worse. It turned into whispers. And then as those whispers were engaged, it turned into a full-bodied voice who could supposedly who townspeople, not just the Bell family, but and it could supposedly go to all 4 churches in Adams and relay the messages back from all those 4 churches. And then, it continued to evolve. It evolved into 4 separate entities, a witch family, as it called itself, which, was possibly sighted in the physical realm at one point by Lucy, or I'm sorry, by Betsy Bell. So there is this idea, that this entity kept growing stronger or kept growing, kept evolving in this dimension until it was able to fracture itself and become 4 separate entities. And until it was able to speak, until it arose from scratches and things like that into a full embodied voice. And I thought that was a very interesting thing about the Bell Witch, because, that's another one of those things that we see throughout folklore. The Amityville Horror, same type of deal. It seemed the Skinwalker Ranch, when new owners take over, seems like the activity starts very slowly, and then as it's engaged, grows or evolves or takes on new forms.
Right. And it seems like, it, I guess, gradually increases its power to try to run people off from that location. And as, whatever it tries, starting out, very subtly, it doesn't work. And then it kind of picks up steam until it gets almost unbearable. And, that's a lot of the haunted type, accounts is like, multiple people has lived at a place and each of them has left. And I think there's even something, a clause in like real estate stuff where people has to state, yes, this place is haunted and, this supposedly happened here.
Right. I think I've heard that before.
Yeah, they have to disclose it. I don't know the exact law, if there's even a law. Maybe if any listeners are real estate, person, they can drop us a line and let us clear that up for us.
But see, man, like that's the thing. Like we have this secret history of the supernatural and the paranormal in everything that we do, like lying just right below the surface. For instance, the big one, the 13th story in buildings. Buildings don't have a 13th floor. That one, the real estate having to say if your house is haunted. I mean, there's all these rules like that are like right below the surface of society that, pretty much say, hey, something's going on and you got to tell us about it, but we're not actually going to acknowledge that it's real.
Right. And it seems like is this kind of one of those things we all just kind of look each other and nod on. We never agree. We never speak of it, but we just kind of just agree it's there. And that's just the rule, the kind of the unwritten rule.
another thing that's interesting about this entity in particular, and about a lot of these entities like the Bell Witch that we read about, is its sense of morality. The witch loved Lucy, John Bell's wife. It repeatedly said that Lucy was one of the best women in the world, but it hated John Bell for whatever reason. It intended to kill John Bell, which eventually it did. And not only that, it had that deep love for Lucy, but it tormented Betsy. It pinched her, poked her, seemingly possessed her at points. It just tormented Betsy. But then at the same time, and I can't remember who Betsy was trying to marry. I can't remember his name, but it repeatedly told Betsy not to marry him. It even appeared to John Bell Jr. and told him to tell Betsy not to marry this guy. So there is this whole thing, other than the trickster entity side of the Bell Witch, that is, the morality side. And it almost makes you wonder, you mentioned that elemental thing about the witch. It almost makes you wonder if the witch itself, and this is a wild theory, but it's one that I come up with in one of my 3 rewatches of Mark of the Bell Witch. It makes you wonder if the witch itself isn't this elemental type creature who, does not experience morality or emotions like we do. Of course it doesn't. It's an elemental like creature, but it still experiences morality in its own way. And it knows, these grievous sins that you've committed. And I'm not saying that John Bell had committed any grievous sins, but it knows, this layout of time and what's going to happen, which is why it told Betsy not to marry this man, and why it eventually killed John. Maybe this spirit, this elemental, knew something, or maybe it was just pissed off because John shot at it, but maybe it knew something, and then later developed a relationship with Betsy and, informed her about what was going to happen. I don't know. But it does, that is one of my theories on what this thing is. Maybe it's this elemental force that, sees time in a different way than we do, and sees what will happen with the choices that we make, or sees the things that we have done in the past that are grievous, insults to the earth or to, its sense of morality. But it's interesting that it does seem to have its own ideas about how things should work out, down to killing John Bell and convincing Betsy not to marry this guy.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some type of morality thing that's going on, and who knows if these, entities can see, into the future, or as you said, like see time differently than we have, and not really seeing into the future, but sees it on a different plane of how things will play out. Maybe it's some type of, what we would call, in our technological world, a AI type thing. And maybe it is some type of intelligence that's, beyond our own as humans. And that's why it did the things it did after it was angered, because was able to peer in, to their lives and attach to it somehow.
Right. And something that I don't think that we've fully mentioned, we may have mentioned this with the Octavia Hatcher portion at the beginning of the show, but there is this existence of the Bell Witch Cave, which is near the Bell Witch Cemetery, the Bell Cemetery. And this cave is supposedly, if you take a rock from this cave, you'll be cursed, and supposedly the entity inhabits this cave. And that goes back to so much. That goes back to the Hellier investigation, and how it seems, like these goblins are coming from the caves here in Kentucky. That goes back to Octavia Hatcher, her being buried in the ground and then coming back. And, that takes it to a whole nother level. That takes it back to a primordial fear and reverence of caves. It's not just a fear of caves that we have, but caves historically And in the human time, or in the human experience, have been a place that people go to seek enlightenment and seek the answers. So there is this idea of caves being a secretive place where these things exist, and where the veil is thinner, and the underground is this place where life and death come together in strange ways. And it's interesting that Kentucky in particular has such a history of caves, with the Mammoth Cave and all of its litany of creatures, which we've talked about on the show many times. And then we find in Adams that the Bell Witch Cave, that the entity maybe is inhabiting this cave. So we're back to caves again.
Yeah, and one thing that kind of struck me, I guess, when they mentioned about taking a rock out of the cave, is how magic practitioners maybe charge stones or something with energy and then use them to perform their rituals and things. If someone takes a rock from this, cave and then takes it with them, they're like, all this stuff will attach to them. It's almost like the rocks and that land itself is charged with some type of energy that can, wherever it goes, it's going to take that energy with it and possibly, react badly upon who took it from its original place.
Dude, I never thought about that, but that is a very, very good theory. I actually bought a rock from the Bell Witch Cave gift shop that's painted like a cat. The owners of it do a lot of different artwork, and they sell it in the gift shop. And I asked her before, I was like, so this is a rock? Is this a rock from here? She's like, no. So they make very clear, that the rocks on sale in the gift shop are not rocks from the cave. After John Bell's death, of course, supposedly caused by the witch and caused by this poison that the witch left by his bedside, which he consumed. Following John's death, it seemed like the activity waned, that things kind of calmed down. But that doesn't mean that they stopped. And then, as a matter of fact, from my understanding, weird things continue to happen into Adams to this day. But one of the most interesting things that I thought that, is just kind of briefly mentioned, I don't think there's a lot on this particular subject, but it's said that a few years after John Bell's death, the witch comes back and converses with John Bell Jr. for like 3 to 4, I think they said days, it may have been hours, but for a good amount of time, about the past, the present, and the future, and about what it was, and about these things. So that's a pretty interesting place. That's a pretty interesting thing that happens there. Suddenly the spirit comes back and reveals all these things to John Bell Jr. and things that have happened, things that will happen. I thought that was an interesting thing, that it comes to him almost like a prophet in a lot of ways, and tells him these things that it knows and these things that it thinks he should know. So wrapping up, I want to personally thank Seth Breedlove for giving us a screener of The Mark of the Bell Witch. It's an excellent film, definitely one of my favorites by Small Town Monsters, but it's hard to pick a favorite because they're all so good. But wrapping up, I just want to reiterate the supreme high strangeness of this case, the fact that it occurs in an area of even more supreme high strangeness on the Cumberland Basin, the Red River. This whole area is littered with things like the Bell Witch, and the Bell Witch is a case very deserving of the attention that it gets. And I'm glad that Small Town Monsters decided to highlight it. But that being said, I recently read something that Seth Breedlove was talking about, a quote of his in I can't remember the exact publication, but it was when he was being interviewed for The Mothman Legacy, which is another Small Town Monsters film that's come out recently, which I haven't got to watch yet, but I've heard it's amazing and I'm looking forward to it. But he said, and I'm paraphrasing here. This is definitely not a. He said, I don't really care if the Mothman is real. What I'm interested in is the culture around the Mothman and around these events of high strangeness. And I honestly totally kind of agree where he's coming from, because as you and I have talked about, and this is a heady philosophical thing, but if you believe you saw something like the Mothman, regardless of what it was, if it's never disproven to you totally, that affects you. That affects you very, very much. And imagine if that happens on a small town level. They become small town monsters. They become the legends, the folklore, the myths of the United States. And they very much are. How many people make pilgrimages out to Point Pleasant every year? How many people make pilgrimages out to Adams every year? These very much are the modern myths of the United States. And Small Town Monsters does an amazing job of capturing those, giving them their own tones, giving them their own, identities, and telling their stories, so that they go on for another generation. And that's very much what happens here with the Bell Witch.
Yeah, like you said, I really appreciate, Seth, allowing us to get an early preview of this, and I really enjoyed it. It was, as I said earlier, it was a very well done documentary. Had some good Twilight Zone vibes to it, which I loved. And, it was very educational of the legend itself. And it kind of did, a historical dive, which I really like when they do that, kind of go back from the beginning and walk us up through the, up to the current point of the legend. And it's kind of like what you said about the Mothman. That was very good, because it doesn't matter if it exists or not. It's the culture that surrounds it. And, when you hear Adams, Tennessee, you automatically think of the Bell Witch. That's what comes to mind. That's what they're known for. That's what that area is known for. Same thing as Kelly, Kentucky is known for the Hopkinsville goblins there that happened. Same thing with Point Pleasant. It's the Mothman. And we can go on and on and list these little points on a map and say, these are what these are known for this paranormal event. And, whether they're real or not, people there experience something, and it's documented. And it's documented in thousands of places, across the globe, and especially here in North America, and especially here in this region we live in. There's definitely something to all this, and like you and I have discussed on several podcasts, they seem to be connected in some form. They could be the same thing.
We've probably said this many times on the show, but we're going to say it again. It absolutely seems like, this area here in the Cumberland Basin, down into Tennessee, over into West Virginia, and Kentucky at large, particularly the Pennyroyal region, the Cumberland Basin, these places, it seems like this is the area where the veil is thin, where creatures, entities, like the witch, the Bell Witch, like the Mothman, like the goblins of Kentucky, like the Sasquatch, like the canids, like the Dogman, the UFOs, the lights in the sky. It seems like this is the area where those things are attracted to for whatever reason. And it wouldn't surprise me if, even now, even today, we still hear stories like the Bell Witch of scratching on the walls, whispers, disembodied voices. And it wouldn't surprise me if the Bell Witch is not finished yet. It wouldn't surprise me if somebody comes forward tomorrow and says that they heard, the witch family speaking to them. But that's going to do it for Midnight in Kentucky this evening. We want to thank Seth Breedlove one more time and the people at Small Town Monsters for sending us a screener copy of Mark of the Bell Witch. As far as I know, it is due out December 15th on video demand platforms, and I think Amazon Prime. I'm not exactly sure about that, but you guys know how to use the internet. You can look things up. But definitely give it a watch. if you're into these things, and I don't know why you would be listening to this if you weren't. If you dig what we do, we're like the poverty level Seth Breedlove of the podcast. So you're gonna totally dig Mark of the Bell Witch. Check it out. Thank you guys so much for listening to Midnight in Kentucky. We're looking forward to all the things that we're bringing you all in the new year. Until the next moon rises, Nightowls, for Midnight in Kentucky, I'm Ben.
I'm Steven.
Good night.
You've been listening to Midnight in Kentucky,
a Ransom Letter Publishing podcast.
Join us on Twitter and Facebook.
Or get in contact with your questions, comments, or stories of high strangeness
at midnightinkentuckypodcast@gmail.com.